how a narcissist breaks down after losing real love forever. And I want to start with the word real, because it is the most important word in this title, and the one that contains the entire psychology of what makes this particular loss different from every other loss the narcissist has experienced or engineered or survived in the long history of relationships that preceded this one. Real, not the supply-generating love that the narcissist has successfully attracted and managed, and eventually discarded across every previous relationship. Not the love that was organized around the narcissist's presented self, the charming, capable, carefully constructed version that the love bombing was designed to elicit a response to. Not the love that was, in its deepest structure, a response to the performance. Real love. The kind that saw through the performance without being repelled by what it saw. The kind that reached past the constructed self toward whatever was actually underneath it and offered something there. Not conditional on the construction continuing to impress, not dependent on the narcissist continuing to perform at the level the idealization required, not organized around who the narcissist was presenting themselves as, but around something more specific and more difficult to replace. Around who the narcissist actually was, underneath everything. And the breakdown that follows the loss of that love is not the breakdown that follows the loss of supply. It is something categorically different, something the narcissist's psychological architecture was not designed to withstand, something that arrives in a place so far inside the construction that none of the construction's defenses can successfully reach it. And by the end of this episode, you are going to understand exactly what happens there, exactly why real love is the one loss a narcissist system cannot metabolize the way it metabolizes everything else, and exactly why the breakdown that follows it is simultaneously the most painful and the most potentially significant thing that has ever happened to the narcissist's interior life. Whether that significance produces anything useful is a different question, and we will get to that too, because honesty requires it. But the breakdown itself, what it is, what it consists of, what it feels like from the inside of a psychology that was never designed to feel things like this. That is the story this episode is going to tell completely. Let's start with what real love actually is in the context of a narcissistic relationship, because the term needs to be grounded before we build anything on it, or the entire analysis floats away from the specific and becomes general in a way that loses its usefulness. Real love, in this specific context, is not simply love that is genuine on the side of the person offering it, though genuine love is part of it. Most of the people who have loved narcissists have offered something genuine, something that was real on their side, even when the dynamic was deeply broken and the cost of the loving was completely disproportionate to what was being received in return. What makes love real in the sense that produces this specific kind of breakdown is not only its genuineness, but its accuracy. Real love, in the sense I am using it here, is love that has survived accurate perception. Love that did not require the idealization to be intact in order to continue. Love that looked at the gap between the presented self and the actual self, the specific, sometimes terrifying gap that the narcissist has spent their entire life engineering situations to prevent people from looking at, and continued. Not because the perceiver was naive or did not see what was there. Because what was there, seen clearly, was still something worth loving. The actual person underneath the construction, wounded and defended and largely inaccessible even to themselves, was met by this love in the windows when the construction briefly stepped back, and the meeting was genuine. And the love that offered itself in those windows was not the love of someone who was fooled. It was the love of someone who saw exactly what was there and loved it anyway. That is the real in this title. And the narcissist, at some level that is below conscious articulation, knows the difference between this and everything that came before it, even if they cannot name the difference. Even if their system responds to the difference with the same destructive behaviors that eventually produced the loss. They know. And the knowing is what makes what comes after the loss different from everything that has come after every previous loss. Here is what the narcissist system has always done with loss, because understanding the default mechanism is what makes the breakdown stand out as something different. The narcissist's relationship with loss has historically been managed through a process so automatic and so efficient that most narcissists are not consciously aware of engaging in it. The process of replacement and retrospective devaluation. The loss of any significant supply source triggers in rapid succession two parallel movements. The first is forward, toward whatever new source of supply is available to fill the gap left by the departure, to restore the regulatory function that the lost relationship was providing, to reassert the narcissist's internal narrative that they are desirable and powerful and capable of generating the admiration they require from whoever they choose to generate it from. The second is backward, the retrospective recasting of the relationship that ended, the gradual rewriting of the departed person's significance in the narcissist's internal story, the reduction of their importance to a manageable size through the specific mechanism of finding sufficient fault with them that the loss becomes, in the narcissist's own account to themselves, something that was either chosen or deserved rather than something that happened to them that they did not want and could not prevent. This combination, replacement forward, devaluation backward, is the narcissist's immune system for relational loss. It is extraordinarily effective. It has processed every previous significant loss in the narcissist's relational history with sufficient efficiency that the losses, however significant they appeared from the outside, did not produce anything that looked from the inside like the kind of grief that a genuine attachment rupture is supposed to produce. Because the mechanism converts the loss before the grief can fully form, routes the emotional energy into the supply, seeking forward movement before it has time to metabolize as genuine mourning. This is how the narcissist survives loss. This is how they have always survived it. And the breakdown we are discussing happens because the mechanism fails. Because real love, love that was accurate, love that survived perception, love that reached the actual self underneath the construction in the windows when the construction stepped back, cannot be successfully processed by this mechanism. And the failure of the mechanism is where the breakdown begins. The retrospective devaluation fails first. Because devaluing someone requires being able to construct a sufficiently negative story about them, and constructing that story requires material, specific instances of failure, inadequacy, incompatibility. The kind of evidence that the narcissist's mind usually has no difficulty assembling, because the person being devalued was in most cases responding to the construction, rather than to the actual self, which means their love was for something that was not entirely real and can be retrospectively revealed as such. But the person who loved the actual self, who was present in the windows, who met what was actually there rather than what was presented, whose love survived accurate perception, cannot be devalued into insufficient significance by this mechanism, because the mechanism requires the narcissist to construct a story in which the person's love was misguided, or conditional, or ultimately about something other than the narcissist themselves. And the love that survived accurate perception does not yield to this construction. It resists it. The narcissist's mind reaches for the material it needs to build the devaluation story and finds instead the memory of someone who saw everything and stayed anyway. And that memory is not material for devaluation. It is its own kind of evidence. Evidence of something real having existed between them that no retrospective story can successfully make into nothing. The devaluation stalls, which means the forward movement, the replacement, lands on a foundation that the devaluation was supposed to have prepared and has not. The new supply source is acquired. The forward movement happens, and the replacement arrives in a psychology that has not successfully processed what it was supposed to have processed before the replacement arrived. And what happens in that psychology is not the clean reset that the mechanism usually produces. It is something messier and more persistent, and considerably more difficult to manage. The replacement does not work the way it usually works. This is the second failure, and it arrives after the first in a sequence that the narcissist system is not equipped to interrupt, because it has never needed to interrupt it before. The new supply provides what supply has always provided: the admiration, the confirmation of the presented self, the regulatory hit of being seen in the way the construction was designed to be seen. All of this arrives, and underneath it, running at a frequency that the new supply cannot reach and the narcissist cannot silence, is something that the mechanism was supposed to have resolved before the replacement was sought. The specific frequency of the real love that was lost. Not the supply it provided, not the regulatory function it served, not the confirmation of the construction it generated in the early stages before the perception became accurate. The specific frequency of being known, of being in the presence of someone whose seeing was genuine, and whose continued presence was therefore not evidence of the construction's success, but evidence of something underneath the construction being worth staying for. The new supply cannot produce this frequency because the new supply does not know what was underneath the construction. The new supply is responding to the construction, which is everything the mechanism usually requires supply to do, which is why the mechanism has always worked before, and which is why it is not working now. Because now the narcissist knows, in the place where the actual self lives, and which the actual love was the only thing that ever genuinely reached, that the new supply is not the same, is not even close to the same, is providing the thing the construction was designed to attract, while failing to provide the thing that the real love provided by accident, by virtue of who she was and what she saw and how she stayed when the seeing should have been enough to make staying impossible. The new supply is confirming the performance. And the performance, in the absence of the one person who ever reached past it, has never felt less like enough. This is where the breakdown actually begins. Not in the loss itself, not in the immediate aftermath when the mechanism is still trying to engage and the forward movement is still generating momentum. In the quiet underneath the new supply, in the moments when the admiration has temporarily subsided and the regulatory hit has worn off and the narcissist is alone in the specific way that the actual self is always alone. Not physically alone, but alone in the sense of being the only one in the room who knows what is actually there underneath everything that everyone else is responding to. In those moments, the loss arrives not as grief in the recognizable sense, but as a specific, sourceless wrongness. A quality of the silence that is different from the quality of silence before she was in his life. Not peaceful. Not the relief of solitude that the avoidance of closeness was always supposed to produce. Something with an edge to it. Something that reaches toward a specific address in his interior and finds nothing there that it was reaching for. She is gone. The actual self, the one she reached, the one that existed in the windows when the construction stepped back in response to the specific quality of her perception. That self has no one reaching for it now. And for a psychology that organized itself around the prevention of being reached, around the maintenance of a construction specifically designed to prevent the actual self from being exposed to the specific risk of genuine knowing. For that psychology to now be experiencing the absence of the entire existence, defending against, as a loss is, in every technical and philosophical sense of the word, a breakdown. The thing the system was built to prevent has become the thing the system is now mourning. And the mourning of something you spent your entire life preventing is the most disorienting grief available to a human being. And what it does to the narcissist who goes through it fully, and why so few do, and what the ones who do discover in the wreckage of what the breakdown leaves behind, that is exactly where we are going next. What the mourning does to the narcissist who goes through it fully is something that has almost no precedent in their interior life, because the interior life of a narcissist has been managed with such thoroughness and such consistency that genuine, unmanaged grief is essentially a foreign experience. Every previous emotional difficulty has been routed through the mechanism, converted into supply, seeking redirected into the energy of the next pursuit, metabolized through the retrospective devaluation that transforms loss into something chosen rather than something suffered. The grief that follows the loss of real love cannot be routed. It has nowhere to go through the usual channels, because the usual channels require a specific kind of material, the kind that comes from a loss that was, in some dimension, manageable. That could be framed as ultimately a choice. That could be retrospectively justified by finding sufficient fault in what was lost. This grief cannot be framed, cannot be justified, cannot be routed through fault finding because the fault finding keeps landing on the narcissist himself, not as an accusation from outside, as an observation from inside, from the actual self, the one that was reached by the real love, the one that is now alone in a way it was never alone before, because it was never reached before and therefore never had to experience the withdrawal of being reached. That self, in the breakdown that follows, begins doing something the narcissist psychology has almost never allowed it to do. It begins to speak, not loudly, not in language the narcissist has readily available, but in the specific way that things that have been suppressed for decades eventually surface when the suppression's primary justification is removed. Quietly, persistently, with a quality of insistence that the mechanism cannot silence, because the mechanism's authority has been compromised by the failure of the replacement to produce what the real love produced. What the actual self says in this surfacing is not comfortable and not simple and not the kind of thing that the narcissist's conscious mind receives without significant resistance. It says, in the only language available to a self that has been without voice for most of its existence, something like this. The construction was not enough. The supply was not what was actually needed. The management of other people's perception, the engineering of admiration, the whole elaborate architecture of the false self, all of it was designed to solve a problem that it was not actually addressing. The problem was never that the narcissist was not sufficiently admired. The problem was that the narcissist was not sufficiently known, was not met in the place where the actual self lives, by someone whose meeting was genuine and whose staying was therefore evidence of something real being worth staying for. That is what the real love provided. That is what the breakdown is mourning, not the supply, not the admiration, not the regulatory function of someone's ongoing confirmation of the constructed self. The specific, irreplaceable, never previously available experience of the actual self being genuinely met. And the narcissist, sitting in the breakdown that the mechanism cannot resolve, is experiencing for perhaps the first time in their adult life what it actually feels like to have had something real and to have been the primary instrument of its destruction. This is the most psychologically significant territory in this entire conversation, and it requires the most careful handling, because this is where the question of what the breakdown actually produces, whether it produces genuine change or simply a new and more sophisticated deployment of the same psychology, becomes impossible to avoid, because the breakdown, as real as it is, as genuinely interior as the grief it generates, does not automatically translate into anything that changes the narcissist's fundamental orientation toward other people and relationships. The surfacing of the actual self in the grief of the breakdown is not the same as the development of the self-awareness and the psychological tools that would be required to live from that self rather than from the construction. It is the surfacing, not the integration. And the distance between those two things is enormous, and the crossing of that distance requires something that the breakdown creates the conditions for but cannot itself provide: sustained, honest, professionally supported engagement with the architecture of the false self and the wound that made it necessary, of a quality and a duration that most narcissists who enter the breakdown either cannot access or cannot tolerate for long enough to produce genuine structural change. What most narcissists do with the breakdown instead is one of three things, and understanding which one is which matters enormously for the people in their orbit who are watching the breakdown from whatever distance they have managed to create. The first thing is the most common. They use the genuine grief of the breakdown as new supply material, not consciously, not with a deliberate calculation that would make it easy to identify and dismiss, but functionally. The grief, the breakdown, the genuine suffering of the loss becomes a new presentation of self, a new version of the charming vulnerability that the love bombing deployed in the initial stages of the relationship, now applied in a more raw and apparently less constructed form that makes it more convincing than anything the construction previously produced. They reach out with the grief. They express the loss with an authenticity that is real, because the grief is real, but that is deployed in a way that is still ultimately organized around producing a specific response in a specific person. They want her back, not because they have understood what the breakdown was trying to show them, because the breakdown is uncomfortable, and she was the one who ended the discomfort of the actual self's aloneness, and the fastest available solution to the discomfort of the breakdown is to restore her presence. The grief is genuine. The motivation behind the reaching is not primarily about her. It is about the regulation of an internal state that has become intolerable. And the difference between those two things, grieving a specific person versus seeking regulation of an internal state, is the entire distance between genuine change and the next iteration of the same cycle. The second thing some narcissists do with the breakdown is intellectualize it. They read about narcissism. They listen to content about narcissistic personality patterns. They arrive at a sophisticated intellectual understanding of their own psychology that they experience as insight, and that functions, in practice, as a new layer of construction. A more self-aware presentation of self that incorporates the language of psychological understanding without the actual structural change that genuine psychological understanding requires. The intellectualization is not nothing. It is better than the complete absence of self-examination that preceded it. But it produces a person who can describe the wound that made the construction necessary without being able to feel the wound directly, who can explain the mechanism of the false self without being able to exist outside of it for more than brief, consciously managed intervals. The self-awareness is real, but it is at the level of the mind rather than the level of the self. And real love, the kind that is lost in this breakdown, was not responding to the mind. It was responding to the self. And the self underneath the intellectualization is still largely as it was before the breakdown, defended, managed, sealed off from genuine expression by the same architecture that the intellectualization is now describing from outside without dismantling from inside. The third thing, the rarest and the most significant, is what happens when a narcissist encounters the breakdown and neither rotes it through the supply, seeking mechanism nor intellectualizes it into a new and more sophisticated construction. When they go into it, when they allow the grief to be what it actually is, not material for a reaching, not an insight to be organized into self-understanding, but the actual experience of having destroyed something real and being the person who did the destroying. This is where the breakdown becomes what it has the potential to be, which is the first genuine encounter with accountability that the narcissist's psychology has ever produced. Not accountability as concept. Accountability as feeling, the specific, unmanageable, profoundly uncomfortable feeling of being the person whose choices made something genuinely good unavailable, not because the world was unkind, or because the circumstances conspired against them, or because the person who left was ultimately insufficient, but because the narcissist was, because the construction was, because the mechanism that has managed every relationship was also the mechanism that made every relationship ultimately unsurvivable for the person inside it, who was not the narcissist. Feeling that, really feeling it, without the mechanism routing it away, without the intellectualization converting it into understanding, before it has had time to be experienced as what it is the beginning of something that genuine therapeutic work can build on, not the change itself. The beginning of the conditions in which genuine change might become possible. It is the crack in the foundation of the construction through which light has entered for the first time. And whether anything is built in that light, or whether the construction repairs itself around the crack before the light has had time to illuminate anything permanent, depends on what the narcissist does next with the most honest moment their psychology has ever produced. For the person who loved them and is watching from a distance, whether that distance was chosen or forced, whether the watching is recent or long past, the breakdown raises a question that deserves an honest answer. Does it matter? Does the narcissist's genuine grief, genuine breakdown, genuine surfacing of the actual self in the morning of the real love they destroyed, does it change anything about what the right decision is for the person who loved them? And the honest answer? The one that requires the most careful holding of the full picture, rather than either the comforting simplification that the breakdown proves the love was real and therefore worth returning to, or the defensive simplification that the narcissist experiences as genuine and therefore nothing has changed. Is this: the breakdown matters, it is real. The grief is not performed and the loss is not manufactured, and the actual self-surfacing in the morning of what was genuinely there is one of the most significant interior events available to a person who's sealed for most of their life. All of that is true, and it is not sufficient, because the breakdown is the beginning of what genuine change would require, not the change itself. And the person who loved him is not the person whose continued presence would produce the change, is instead almost always the person whose return would short-circuit the breakdown before the breakdown has had time to do what it is the only thing capable of doing. Her absence is not cruelty. It is the only condition under which what the breakdown began might be completed, and completing it or not is the narcissist's work. Not hers. It has always been his work. The real love she gave him was never supposed to do the work for him. It was supposed to show him that the work was worth doing,